Right. So thank you for coming to this seminar. I'm happy that the room is full towards the end of the semester. So thank you again. My name is Fu Hualin. I'm the Associate Dean of the Law Faculty. We have a very interesting presentation with a fascinating title on rule of law in China. Since the amendment of the Chinese Constitution, it's a few months ago, or just last month, right? We've been talking about this for so long, as if it happened for many years ago. Actually, it's only a month or so ago. So the biggest question for many of us is, what about rule of law in China? Right? For the people of my generation, went to Chinese law school in late 70s, we have gone through a life circle. Right? When we were young, we studied law. Now we are retiring. We're still talking about rule of law. Where is it? Where to locate China in comparison not only to Hong Kong but to many other countries. So we need some good reference point to make a good judgment. So here today we have this wonderful topic which will give us some reference point. Rule of law in China, historical, cultural, and comparative analysis based on the World Justice Project data. So we will have something hands-on, objective, and then hopefully at the end of the seminar we have a better idea as to where we're heading, where we are right now. Should we be satisfied after 40 years legal reform, or should we talk about legal reform for another 40 years? I'm honored to introduce the speaker, Professor Jeffrey Thomas. Is a professor of law and associate dean for international affairs at University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law. And he's here to review one of our LM program. So he's an important person in particular for this occasion. So without further ado, the floor is yours. We have about 1.5 hours, probably 40 minutes presentation. I hope we'll have ample time to have some Q&A and discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm gratified to see so many of you here in the room, to have a full room. And I'm very interested to hear your reaction. I think that you're in a position in Hong Kong to see what's going on in China in a way that is very personal and also very meaningful. And so I would appreciate your input and your suggestions and your ideas in response to this. This project grows out of a larger body of work that is about the interface between culture and law. When I came to China the first time in 1999, it was in the midst of a great deal of discussion about rule of law, primarily, I think, in order to try to get WTO membership. And there was a lot of legal reform underway for a variety of different reasons. And that reform has now led me, as an observer who spent the year in China teaching, into a pathway where I'm interested in the rule of law. And over the course of the year, I became personally more receptive, more sensitive to the Chinese perspective on rule of law than I had been when I came. I felt like I was a young American missionary there to sort of convert the world to American-style rule of law. And I sort of began my year that way. But over time, and through questioning and interfacing with professors and students and others, I became more sensitive to the idea that there isn't a uniform way of thinking about rule of law, that rule of law can mean a lot of different things, and it can promote a lot of advantages in different ways. So my own personal journey has been to become more sensitive to cultural implications on rule of law. And in particular, I've been very concerned about what I view as sort of a version of Western imperialism to try to impose on other countries. The most prominent example in my kind of experience has been in Afghanistan, to try to sort of by will impose Western ideology or Western notions of rule of law, which do have some value, but also have very strong Western underpinnings. So I've been part of a project of trying to understand the cultural aspects of law and the cultural aspects of rule of law. And that's what this project is part of. A number of years ago, I discovered the World Justice Project as a measure of rule of law. And in fact, there were some friends of mine and I who had talked about trying to measure rule of law. And it was sort of a nascent ambition at one point in time. And I'm very glad to see there was a lot of money invested and there's a good data set available now. So that's what I'm going to use primarily as the basis for discussion today. Usually I start with kind of a roadmap, but this time I want to start with my thesis and a roadmap so that you understand kind of where I'm coming from. I've got a lot of visualizations of data, and so I hope they are understandable and helpful. And I think that by telling you my thesis at the outset that may help. So my thesis is that there are cultural limits. Chinese culture provides limits and slows development of rule of law. And in particular, the two areas I'm going to look at are fundamental rights and restraint on governmental power. And there are cultural aspects that limit the rule of law in those areas in China, and I think in other Chinese cultural countries, and I think in Asian countries more generally. So I'm going to be using Japan a number of times as a comparator. The roadmap is I want to start with just some general comments about rule of law. I want to introduce you to the World Justice Project, and then I want to dive into the data with respect to China. And while I use the term historical, I'm a little embarrassed about having used that term because when you use that term in connection with China, it usually means, several thousand years. Unfortunately, in my case, what I really mean is historically from the standpoint of the World Justice Project. So it's all the way back to 2012, right? So it's not really historical. And I apologize if you were coming hoping to hear more history and I'm disappointing you. But I do have a data set that goes from 2012 until 2017, and it does provide some insights, I think. So I want to talk about China's progress. I want to talk about then the cultural limitations and introduce that concept, and then do some comparative analysis, and then I'll have a few conclusions. Basically, good news, bad news, good news, conclusions. So, rule of law is actually, with the introduction, you could actually say that rule of law and China don't really go together. And there are some people who say that rule of law has no content at all. It's just verbal rhetoric. It just means I'm good because I believe in the rule of law. And I don't go that far. I think there is content, but it has a very complex origination story. So I think that it really goes back to the Greeks. It starts with the rule of reason, but it's not really rule of law at that point. It goes through Roman law, where it's really something that the Chinese would be comfortable with, rule by law, but not truly rule of law. The emperor can do no wrong. The emperor is the source of all law, and so it's not really rule of law in a Western sense. It's substantially influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and the Enlightenment reforms, where we're starting to think about legal institutions in significantly different ways than had been the case prior to that. And American constitutionalism is certainly part of that, though it's a unique product of a confluence of factors that brought about the American Constitution. But there are elements of the American Constitution that I think are strongly associated with rule of law, at least in its Western, thicker version, in particular separation of powers, right? And the idea that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land and it governs all entities within a legal system. So I think that is consistent with rule of law, but not really the source of rule of law. The term, I think, in the literature review that I've done, is most accurately traced to A.V. Dicey, who was part of the reform movement in England in the 19th century, and the reference was to the king, that the king should be subject to the rule of law, that law should be governing over the monarchy, which is, at the time, a pretty radical proposition, but it is very much consistent with this Enlightenment philosophy, and it's certainly consistent with American constitutionalism, which was in large part a reaction to the monarchy in Great Britain. So, but all of this shows, I think, that rule of law at its core is a very Western notion. And so I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that it's a Western notion and that we need to try to adapt it in ways that are proper. And, you know, that, of course, is the big question. What is proper? What's imperialism? What's, sufficiently recognizing local culture and local customs. So to sort of sum up the definition, and I really like the definition that came from Richard Fallon in a Columbia Law Review article in the late 90s that was really about constitutionalism and rule of law, but I think that he, to me, really captures the essence of it. I've indicated that some people say that there's no meaning to rule of law at all. There certainly is no consensus for what it means. There is a lot of discussion. I do think that there's consensus that there are thicker and thinner theories of rule of law. And what's the difference between the thick and the thin theory? I think predominantly fundamental rights. So that when you move more into fundamental rights, freedom of speech, that those things are the thicker theory of rule of law, and other kinds of sort of democratic notions are part of the thicker theory. And I don't want to try to understand the details of those, but I just want to say there's a thick version and a thin version, and that gives us some room for maneuvering. The strands that were identified by Fallon are supremacy of law, which to me is at the core of the Western ideal of rule of law. And that's really where I think we have the biggest challenges when we talk about rule of law in China. Rules that are transparent and stable and legitimate, that's part of rule of law. Dispute resolution is part of rule of law. Some aspect of rights, though, how robust those rights are and the particular nature of those rights could vary. And then this kind of vague concept of some respect for the law. It's a cultural phenomenon that people sort of look to the law as a way of resolving disputes, as a way of sort of ordering society, as a way of having a sense of moral judgment. So this is my attempt to illustrate what I think the strands would look like, that they overlap to a large degree, and they all sort of provide different robustness. And then this is what I think the thin theory looks like. Again, these are just sort of illustrations of ideas. There are not a lot of detail that I need to do with these. This is my depiction of the rule of law in the United States, using these circles and enlarging the circles based on what I think is the strength or the weakness of those things. In the U.S., the supremacy of law is extremely important. And the idea that the law is above everything is a very strong cultural phenomenon in the U.S. And rights are very important, but, you know, other areas of law, the rules are a little less clear. I did this first for China, and so I still have, this is my original depiction of rule of law in China based on these different strands. And today I might even be shrinking some of those circles even more. But rules are still pretty robust, and maybe that circle would be a little bit bigger. Again, this is just sort of a visualization to get an idea of what I mean by the definition of rule of law. I want to now transition to a data-driven approach to rule of law from the World Justice Project. The project was founded in 2006. It's predominantly funded by Microsoft money. So the general counsel of Microsoft made $1 billion as general counsel to Microsoft. He was committed to the rule of law and took some of his riches and, with help from others, started a nonprofit to promote the rule of law and to measure it. And he got academics involved, and it's a pretty robust project. And I like the work that they're doing. They do an annual rule of law index. It's an evaluation of 8 factors. I'll identify the factors in just a moment, and 44 sub-factors. It's a huge project every year. There are 110,000 survey responses, 2,700 legal experts surveyed in 113 countries on an annual basis. So it's really big. It's a lot of resources that are devoted to this. They take these survey results and then they map them onto these sub-factors, and they use a scale from 0 to 1, and they scale them so that they can measure across different countries, and then give us a score. And then they average those scores and then do a lot of rankings. And so we'll talk some about the rankings in just a moment. These are the 8 factors. Constraint on government powers, absence of corruption, and open government. Those 3, I think, line up pretty well with supremacy of law, and there's also some aspect of respect for the law in there, certainly open government. Fundamental rights is rights. That one's pretty straightforward. Order and security is something that isn't talked about a lot in the rule of law circles because it's often taken as a given, but it is important, and there are many countries that don't have order and security, and order and security are fundamental to rule of law. So that's rules and rules enforcement, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, criminal justice are all dispute resolution, rules enforcement, ways of sort of ordering society. So they fall into those categories that would be in the strands. So those are the 8 factors that are used. This is a spider diagram showing China's scores for 2017 on all 44 subfactors, right, in a spider web diagram. And this data all comes from the annual report. The annual report's available on the internet. You can download it in a PDF, and they'll actually even let you download the data that's used to generate these reports in an Excel spreadsheet, so you can manipulate it and use it. And I use that for some of this presentation. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's so detailed that you can't really make much of it, but it gives you a quick visual snapshot. And the visual snapshot shows you there's okay strength. Right? So here, these peaks show that there's some area where rule of law is good, and then there are the valleys, and the valleys show things that are really weak. You can't see it very well, but there's the middle line is the midpoint. That's 0.5. And so at the inside is 0, and there are a few areas that China is kind of close to 0. You also can't see it very well, but this gray line, there's the kind of blue or purple line, but the gray line is last year's score. So you have a little bit of difference, and there isn't, the movement is not very quick, but there is some movement, and I think it is somewhat interesting and illustrative. So that's just sort of a snapshot. What the snapshot tells us is this is sort of a visual depiction that China's rule of law has a significant room for improvement, right? That there's not a complete absence of law, but there's not certainly a robust rule of law. The number 1 country in the world is Denmark. Denmark's diagram is almost a round circle, almost all the way at 1. It's a nice, pretty round circle. So it's quite a contrast. These are the scores and the rankings for China on the various factors. So I'll just point out a couple of things. The overall score is 0.50. That's an average of all the factors, right? And that's right at sort of the median point. And so China is around the median on an international standard. There are the global rank I look at a lot because that tells you out of the 113 countries, China is 75th. Not particularly good, but it could be worse. Russia is worse. I'm using that for a comparator in a moment. And Afghanistan is worse. But there are also these regional rankings and income rankings. So China's income category is the kind of upper middle income countries. And so China is compared to the upper middle income countries and comes out at 26 out of 36, which again is not great, but not terrible. And then the regional rank is 12th out of 15. The region is Asia, but the regional rankings I keep objecting to because it includes New Zealand and Australia. And New Zealand and Australia, in my view, are really not Asian. And they're Western, and they skew the data. And they show up, they look like Western countries in terms of their scores. So it's really shouldn't be 12 out of 15. It should probably be 10 out of 13. Because I wouldn't include Australia and New Zealand. If you look on these factors, the ones I'm going to be focusing on primarily going to be constraint on government, a little bit about corruption and fundamental rights. But you can see that the highest score is in order and security. And I think all of us would probably agree that China is a pretty safe place to travel and be, and that reflects an order and security score that's quite high. And the national ranking for order and security is 28 out of 113, the global ranking. And so that's really quite good. The ranking is pretty high at the income level and pretty high, well, it's about at the average for the regional rank. And the score is 8.0. Constraint on government powers, that to me is the closest factor to this idea that law is supreme, that I believe is at the heart of rule of law, at least in its Western version. And even in the thin theory, I think that's pretty much at the heart. And the score there is 0.40. The ranking is really quite poor. It's 100 out of 113. So there's certainly weakness. And to me, the constitutional amendment is totally consistent with this. And in fact, whether the Constitution was amended or not amended, the scores would have been the same, right? These are functional based on the perception of legal experts and of average people, what they think in response to survey questions, right? So these are all perceptual, which goes to that idea of respect for law. But they include legal experts who are part of the survey. And, you know, my experience is that this is in terms of China, and my experience there is probably pretty accurate. Fundamental rights is the other area I want to look at, and the score there is also very low. It's actually even worse than constraints on governmental power, right? So it's 0.30. It's 108 out of 113. That means there are only 5 countries in the world that are surveyed. So it's not every single country, but out of the 113, there are only 5 who have a worse score on fundamental rights. So fundamental rights score is very weak. And if we went back to the spider chart and looked at those valleys, a bunch of those valleys are around fundamental rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of association. Surprisingly to me, labor union freedom is not very strong. And we'll look at some of that in a little more detail in just a moment. So that's kind of the overall picture of China. This is my effort. I don't know how good I am at building these charts, but this is the historical from 2012, right? But it shows you the scores. The most important score is the red dotted line in the middle. That's the overall score. And you see there was sort of a downward dip in 2014, and then it's an upward trajectory, that there is progress being made. That's what the data is showing. And a couple of these, the top one is security, and it's pretty strong anyway. It goes up a little and down a little bit. But the light blue one is from the light blue dotted line. It goes up on a pretty good trajectory. That's civil justice. And the scores have improved quite a lot in China for civil justice. The green line is for corruption, and that actually it went down a little bit in 2014, so it's actually anti-corruption, I should be more precise. But it's on an upward trajectory as well. And so that shows pretty good. And if you just visually look at this, the trend looks very mildly positive. You know, upward trajectory. What's the downward projection? The bottom line is individual rights, right? And under the current leadership in China, I think that most people would agree that there's been a restriction on the ability to exercise individual liberties. And so it really isn't that much a surprise that there's a downward trajectory, but the scores are very low. And this is an average of all of the fundamental rights. There are certain fundamental rights like equal protection that have some significant protection in China, and it's sort of propping up the score because the scores on some of the other areas are extremely low. And I'm going to show you those for 2017 in just a moment. But the overall point here is that there is positive movement. It's modest, but it's moving in the right direction, that the government's efforts to move towards either rule of law or rule by law, depending on what you want to say. Either way, there's progress. Mild, but there is progress. And that the biggest weakness really is individual rights. Corruption is an interesting thing that I'm going to talk a little more about in a few minutes. But there's generally a pretty positive spin. So these are the individual factors for constraint on government power. And the way this visualization works is the purple shows the score for China. The green shows the average for the upper middle income countries. And then the yellow or orange shows the average for East Asia and the Pacific, which again is a little bit skewed because of Australia and New Zealand. So you can see that there are limits on the legislature, that's pretty strong. And, you know, when I'm talking about this, I usually just say it's because the legislature has no power. So it doesn't really matter. Of course, there's no legislative corruption because the legislature is just sort of a rubber stamp. The judiciary is still kind of a problem. And I think that's certainly consistent with anecdotal evidence that I have. There's been some improvement in independent auditing. I think that represents the Communist Party's self-regulation. And that the score of 0.50, which is right about at the average for middle-income countries, is an average score, which is, you know, not too bad, especially considering that fundamentally the idea that the party is subject to law is problematic. Sanctions for official misconduct, that actually is above the average for upper middle income countries, 0.49. I also think that represents some progress on the anti-corruption effort. Non-governmental checks, the score is very low, right? It's almost zero, 0.14. That's probably the area that China has the greatest weakness when it comes to this. And then the lawful transition of power, that's also a low score because nobody knows how the power is being transferred, right? It's not transparent at all. It all happens in the back room. The party makes the decision and then there's a big announcement made. And so that's reflective of this data. So the data is, I think, reasonably accurate. It tells a story that's not a very positive story. And, you know, the interesting question I want to address is what's the future hold and what's the cultural implications here? Fundamental rights is a story that's really pretty similar. I'm just going to go straight to some of the big problems, right? Freedom of expression, there probably is no surprise in this room that China's scores are very low. This doesn't have the international ranking, but it's one of the lowest in the world for freedom of expression. Freedom of religion is a little bit better, but also very, very weak. Freedom of association. The Chinese government's very concerned about people associated in, you know, having a coup or a revolution or whatever. So any kind of association is subject to very careful regulation. What surprised me about this data more than anything was the labor union stuff. I was like, whoa, this is a post-communist country. Why? I would expect labor rights to be very robust. I interpret this as, so there are two interpretations. One is that the communist revolution in China was driven by peasants, not by workers. So I'm going to compare China to Russia in a moment. In Russia, the communist revolution was driven by workers. So they still have really robust protection for labor unions. And I think what's happened is that capital and businesses have been associated with the government and with the party. And capital doesn't really like labor unions, right? It's sort of bad for investment, and so that the labor rights have eroded over time in China. So due process of law, that's the number, which this is actually really good to see that there's a strong number there. It's right about at the average, but at 0.51. That's the one that's kind of propping up the individual rights for China. Non-discrimination is below average, but, you know, there's some effort there. Right to life and security, you know, that particular data point is strongly influenced by whether you have the death penalty or not. If you're a country with the death penalty, then you get a lower score. So that's what's going on there. Security is pretty clear, but you have, you know, the risk of capital punishment. So let me turn to some cultural analysis now. This work was done by a guy named Gert Hofstede, who was or is a social psychologist. He began working with IBM in the 1960s and 1970s, trying to help them figure out why they couldn't manage their international company in an effective way, because there were cultural problems when they tried to manage across the borders. And so he helped them understand that. In the process of doing that work, he identified these factors and created measures for these factors. The power distance index, individual versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance, and the long-term orientation. And I think there are one or two that have been added since his initial work. But I'm focusing on these, and the ones in red are the ones that that I want to talk about today. So I'm not going to talk about masculinity and femininity and uncertainty avoidance. But the power distance index is essentially the amount of toleration that the people have for centralized power. And if they have a high level of toleration, the score is high. If they have low tolerance, then the score is low. And it's a very cultural thing. I mean, how much are you willing to put up with that sort of centralized authority? How much individual autonomy do you want to have? How much do you want to have checks on central authority? Individual versus collectivism is a way of thinking about individual rights. And individual rights are at opposition with collective rights. So to me, as an American, I almost don't get this because we're so oriented towards individual rights. We don't even think about collective rights. The example that I often think about is there's a case from, I think, the 1950s in which Nazis are authorized to do a protest through a Jewish community. Now, how offensive can you get, right? I mean, that's extremely offensive, but it was held to be their constitutional right, First Amendment right, freedom of expression to do that. That's not necessarily the right result. Right? That gives very little value to the community. And so there is this tension between individual and community rights. Individual rights are often protected at the expense of some community values. So that's a cultural orientation as well. Long-term orientation is pretty self-explanatory. You're looking to the long term. So, next. Yes. Uh-oh. We're stuck. My slides have big pictures in them, so it's hard to handle all the data. It's trying to change to the next slide. Sorry. What I'm going to show you is what the scores are for various countries on these factors. The long-term orientation I'll get to at the end of the presentation, but power distance and individual versus collective I want to talk about right away, and I want to show it to you if the technology will let me. Let's see if I can try. I don't know if I want to reboot or not. Big data file. I'm sorry. So while we're waiting, does anybody have any questions about anything you want to ask? Can't find the file. Now it doesn't like my file. There we go. I may just leave it in this mode so that I don't run into problems. So this is the power distance index. And the countries that I've shown are countries that I'm using for comparative purposes, in part because of their rule of law scores and in part because of their geographic considerations. So as I indicated a few moments ago, Denmark is the #1 country in the world for rule of law. You see the power distance index on the top is the score for Denmark. It's about 18. And then the next one down is Australia. Australia is in the top 10, I think, for rule of law, or top 15. It's certainly #1 in Asia. Again, though, I don't think Asia is very representative. Japan is the blue bar, and Japan has a score of about 52 on the power distance index. Singapore is higher, and then the UK and Hong Kong are even higher. The U.S. score is, and I'm not sure that this data is actually 100% right, but this is what it's showing, and you see that China and Russia are both really high scores on the power distance index. I think that the UK score is probably a mistake in terms of the way that I put the data in here. But the China score and the Russia score are accurate. That means that there's a very high tolerance for centralized power. And if we think about China from a historical standpoint, now thinking thousands of years, not back to 2012, certainly, in the imperial period, through the revolution, the average Chinese person doesn't feel like they are very empowered. That there's a strong central government for a very long time, and they do what they do, and you just sort of live with it. And I think that's true of Russia as well, which is the bottom blue line. Here are the scores for the individual versus community. And as you would expect, China, which is the second bar on the top, no, China is the bar down here. China has a very orientation towards the individual. Denmark, Australia, the United States, the U.S., they're very strong for individuals. So the point that I want to make is that when you look at these government constraint scores, so these are the scores and the ranking for these countries on the government constraint factor from the World Justice Project. The score for China is 0.44, the ranking is 100. The score for Russia is 0.39, the ranking is 101. Those are representative of a strong cultural commitment to centralized power and an absence of restraint on that centralized power. And the countries that are at the top of the scale tend to have a cultural attitude that has suspicion for centralized power, and that restrains that centralized power and puts more emphasis on the individual over the collective. So I wanted to show you what the China-Russia dichotomy was like. So what this chart does is it takes the data for constraint on governmental power and uses a spider diagram for each of the sub-factors for constraint on power. The table that I was just looking at was the average. So if you'll see on this table, China does pretty well on the legislative power, which is the top one here, and pretty well on the bottom one, which is that government officials are sanctioned. It's above the black line, black dotted line is the average for the middle income countries, upper middle income countries. And it's not going to be very close to the green line, because the green line is what is the upper income countries. Those are the countries that tend to be in the top 10 or so. And so China is good on those 2 points, but Russia is actually better on the transition of power being subject to law, and better on 1.5, which is government powers are subject to non-governmental checks. Even though Russia is a very much sort of authoritarian regime at this point, the power of the press and the power of non-governmental organizations, the fact that there is sort of an opposition that exists, although you're at risk of being poisoned or killed if you're in the opposition, but there still is an opposition party, is reflected in this, though the scores for Russia are still below average, but they're above what you would see for China. And the reason why I've included Russia is because it's an interesting case where we have a large, powerful communist country that's transitioning to something somewhat different, at least, than communism. And China is transitioning to something that's somewhat different as well. So I think that's an interesting comparison to look at. What about with respect to fundamental rights? Well, the story with fundamental rights is also similar to the story with constraint on government, except that China's scores are even worse on fundamental rights compared to others. Though what I want to point out about this is that Japan, which I think of as a very sort of Western integrated Asian country, and they are pretty good for rule of law, but their score on individual rights is still not very close to what we see at the top, right? It's 0.76, which is about halfway between the average and the high score of 0.90. As an American, I sort of expected that the American fundamental rights would be really high, and they're not very high, right? At 0.72. The reason for that is because there's a lot of discrimination problems in America. And those discrimination problems bleed over into individual rights as well. There are equality problems that are very significant in the U.S. But Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, those all represent pretty robust rule of law societies that are Asian, and in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, I think significantly Chinese, and yet their scores are, I mean, they're good, but they're not great. I mean, the ranking is 35th for Hong Kong out of 113. Now, when I first started doing work that was looking at Hong Kong, one of the hypotheses was that maybe it was because Hong Kong had been reunited with China, and maybe it was the Chinese government that was taking away individual rights. And I think there's some truth to that narrative, but to check that narrative, I went to Singapore, and the Singapore score is a little bit higher, but not that much higher. And Singapore doesn't have this kind of meddling by the PRC, the Chinese government, in their affairs. So I think that there is some evidence that there's a cultural limit. So my argument is that while fundamental rights can certainly improve, they'll reach a certain point where they're not going to go beyond that. And that we can't really expect that fundamental rights in China will ever get to the point where the fundamental rights are being protected in Western countries. And again, to me, that's neither right or wrong. It's simply different. And that's reflective of a stronger commitment to community values and a lesser commitment to individual values. But at the present, there's a lot of room for improvement. That I would like to see China move up to where Singapore and Hong Kong are, and that would be, a doubling of their score, more than doubling. So here's what the individual rights looks like in a comparison of Russia, which again is this big sort of somewhat post-communist, although that's debatable. But in any event, it's an effort to reform a communist country. You can see that there is some robustness for individual rights, and this one at the bottom that's really high, this is the labor rights. Oh no, that's freedom of belief. The labor rights are over here. Yeah, it's this one on this corner are labor rights. And so Russia is above the average for upper middle income countries and not that far away from the upper income countries because labor rights aren't really that robust in those countries either. Russia is quite high down here on freedom of belief, which is, there's the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a fair amount of religious freedom. China is much lower. The score here, this is the freedom of opinion and expression. And, China's score is very low there. So that's sort of the visualization. What's the most interesting thing for me now at the current time is what I am thinking about is the anti-corruption paradox. So here's the paradox that I'm wrestling with. If you have a strong central authoritarian government, they tend to be corrupt because they can be. There's no accountability for that government. And so why is it that the Chinese government is so worried about corruption? So one narrative is to say, well, it's because it's just a tool to eliminate competition, that the people in power are using anti-corruption as a way to get rid of people who are threats. And while there's some truth to that, I don't think that's explanatory enough of the narrative. I think it goes broader than that. And the fact that it's showing up in the rule of law index as positive scores, I think is evidence of that. So what else could it be? I've started talking to people about this, people who have a lot of experience in China. I had a conversation with a former judge who's now a dean of a law school in China and said, you know what, what's the answer to this paradox? There is a concern about legitimacy. And the Communist Party wants to maintain legitimacy, and they know that if the corruption is too bad, that it will undermine their legitimacy in the face of the average person. And that lack of legitimacy threatens the viability, long-term viability of the party, either through revolution or something else. I mean, I don't know. I think they're worried about a revolution, but there is a concern about legitimacy. And while that concern doesn't make the party democratic, it suggests that there is some limit being imposed by the people in some fashion. And so I find that extremely interesting, and it's the good news, right? The fact that the party is concerned about its legitimacy suggests to me, once we look at the long-term orientation, right? So the scores, the big scores here are Japan, China, which is in red, and a little bit surprising to me, Russia has a very long-term orientation as well. Those scores on long-term orientation show that culturally the Chinese people take the long view. And the long view isn't 12 or 15 or what was the frame in the introduction, 40 years. When I heard 40 years, I thought to myself, 400 years, right? The size of an imperial dynasty is sort of the long term, right? And I think what the anti-corruption narrative tells me is that in the long term, there will continue to be reform, and we will move towards something. I don't know what it will be. I mean, democracy is also something that is difficult to define and hard to know what it means, but we will move towards something that requires more accountability of the government, but it's going to take a very long time. I mean, my conclusions are the bad news is culturally the commitment to centralized power. The people just aren't going to demand democracy because they just culturally aren't attuned to that. Eventually, I think there will be movement in that direction, but it will take a long time. And the same is true with respect to fundamental rights, that individual rights are not culturally high value within the culture. And so you're never going to see, probably ever, but certainly not in the next 40 or 50 years, scores that look like countries that are in the West, because culturally they have a different kind of commitment towards individual rights. But there is still progress, right? There's slow progress being made. And the good news is that in light of that long-term orientation, I believe that there will continue to be progress over time, that there is this sense of accountability that the Communist Party feels, and I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how it's going to happen. I think it's going to be slow, but I do think that there is a pretty good chance for progress in the long run. The fundamental thing for me goes back to the market and the experience that I had in 1999 and since in returning to China. I cannot understand how people will have the choice of toothpaste. I can buy, 100 different types of toothpaste, but I can't choose who's going to be my, my mayor or my leader. I mean, ultimately, at some point, there's going to be more choice and there's going to be more accountability. And, the party is not going to give up very fast, and the people, I think, aren't going to demand that there be reforms very fast because of these cultural limits. But I do think that there's progress, and I do think that people see it as a positive thing. The other sort of narrative that I'll use to kind of conclude with is about traffic. So I did an early project on rule of law in China that had to do with traffic and traffic patterns. And when I talk about traffic, people often smile or laugh. When I first went to China, there was no abiding by traffic laws at all. The example that just sticks in my head is I was in a taxi. The taxi was taking me to the university, and he decided to take a shortcut on the bike path going the wrong way, right? he's going the wrong way, and there are bikes on the bike path going this way and that way, trying to avoid being hit by the taxi driver. And that wasn't abnormal in 1999. Today, traffic is a lot different. It still has aspects that are Chinese, but it's much more orderly because I think people understand that abiding by the traffic rules benefits everybody. That, being in a traffic jam for 3 hours is not good. If you'll, live by the rules, then we'll all be happier together, right? That gridlock where you get stuck in, you stop the traffic because you're waiting for someone to go in front of you. That's stupid. It doesn't do anybody, you're 6 feet ahead, but you're blocking traffic. And so I think that the traffic patterns, in my experience, are much better in China than they used to be. And that's a sort of narrative of progress in the rule of law. So we want to have some time for question and answer. That is, I can't do the end because I switched over my format, but that's the end. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I like your comparison between choosing toothpaste and choosing leaders. So now your narrative is once you start choose your toothpaste, you will start choose your political leader. If you put it another way around, if the bargain is the condition, the fact that you can choose toothpaste is you are not going to choose leaders. If you start choose leaders, then you will have no right to choose toothpaste. So I'm not sure how that works.
That's a fair point.
We have 20 minutes. We start a little late, and I'm sorry you haven't.
I'm sorry.
So questions, Mike?
Hi, thank you for a very enjoyable talk. I disagree with you profoundly on traffic.
You think it's worse now, or you think it's not better?
No, I think you completely misunderstand the significance of traffic. I'm joking, of course, to some extent. But I would argue that the chaos that you initially experienced was a reflection of the fact that driving on the roads in China is a process of negotiated rulemaking. The drivers make it up as they go along. And that was an inherently democratic time, being a car driver. The fact that you now have more order is perhaps a reflection of the imposition of more authoritarian tendencies on traffic flows, and reflecting of the constitutional amendment, Article 1, the fact that communism is now defined as leadership of the Communist Party. I had actually thought of that kind of metaphor before. I lived in a place called Shanghai, which is quite a worse sort of place, should I say. And I concluded on traffic that the fact that traffic is so bad reflected one very important dimension to Communist Party rule in China, which is the fundamental rule is obedience to the Communist Party. And basically, as long as you fulfill that requirement, you can do virtually anything you want. So we can differ in understanding the traffic. I have a more serious question of the nature of the data gathering process. But perhaps others would like to speak first.
Thank you, Professor. In your depiction of rule of law in the earlier part of your presentation, you mentioned independent judiciary, which to me as a layman is the bedrock of rule of law. Could you enlighten me on this point? Thank you.
Sure. It comes within the dispute resolution area for the strands, and then for the World Justice Project, it's within civil justice. And it's actually 3 places. It's in civil justice, criminal justice, and it's also in the restraint on government. That if you have an independent judiciary with judicial review, then you have the judiciary as a restraint on other governmental branches. So it's there, and it's robust in places like Denmark, the judicial independence. And I agree with you. I mean, I had at one point looked at work that was focusing more on the courts. This is at a higher level of abstraction, and certainly independent judiciary is an important having independence, having some power, are important for rule of law.
I see. Well, you remember that Andrew Lee, former Chief Justice, said to judges, the master is the law. But in China, there's no way. The master is the party, not the law. So
Yes.
How do you be so optimistic about the prospect of rule of law in China?
Yeah. I'm optimistic because I'm taking a really long-term view. I don't think that, and I'm also optimistic because I do think that the party is using rule by law, and that while rule of law is preferred, from my standpoint, to rule by law is still progress. That it is an ordering of society that is helpful for the people, that allows for economic development, that allows for some protection of property and protection of some rights. But I mean, I think it's progress. In the long run, I just am really struck by, and I've just started working on this corruption area, but I really am struck by that initiative as being contrary to what one would expect from an authoritarian regime. And it's, I haven't, again, I've just started looking at corruption, but I think it's probably exceptional that if you look at other regimes that have strong central authority, it'll be hard to find effective anti-corruption initiatives. So to me, and it's the narrative that comes from talking to people who have convinced me. I mean, I think maybe we'll see what the data ultimately shows, but that there is some sensitivity to a sense of legitimacy.
I'm curious how you might factor Taiwan into your analysis. I mean, I take it that Taiwan wasn't considered in the study.
Correct.
But I mean, do you think that because culturally, I mean, Taiwan arguably as a Chinese society would be similar to Hong Kong, Singapore?
Yeah. The original comparative analysis that I did was supposed to be China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and the Taiwan data wasn't available. I mean, I think it's a political issue that the World Justice Project has decided that they're not going to push Taiwan in order to get cooperation from China. And so they have not included Taiwan, so I don't have the data. My hypothesis is that Taiwan is going to look a lot like Singapore and Hong Kong, probably not quite as robust in terms of the rule of law. But that's just based on, very limited information about Taiwan. I don't really have much information. I've been to Taiwan. I've had a few Taiwanese students. I've seen some press accounts from Taiwan, but I don't really know. But that would be my suspicion, is that it's going to look like them. But I don't know.
Yeah. Can you say something more about the source of the data and who's doing the surveys?
So the surveys are administered through marketing companies that are retained by the World Justice Project. And the surveys, I believe, I just happened to stumble on this when I was looking at the report. I believe that in China they're face-to-face surveys. They're not telephone surveys. But there is methodology information in the annual index. And the data is not perfectly accurate because for convenience, they focus on the 3 largest cities. So the fact that you're excluding the rural areas of China skews the data towards rule of law, probably, and makes it a little bit unrepresentative. But the same kind of skewing is happening in other countries too. Although, in Hong Kong, that you wouldn't have that issue, I don't think. But in other countries, they do. The survey instrument is prepared by the World Justice Project people. They have social scientists and law people who are involved in the process. I'm not one of them, so I don't have, sort of personal knowledge about it, but it's a fairly robust process. And the surveys are controlled by them, but they're administered through these marketing companies.
So my question is, on your experience in China and your observation on the culture and history. And do you think something that China would contribute to the understanding of the rule of law, or maybe refine or redefine the concept in a certain way?
Certainly that's been the ambition of the Chinese leaders, the rule of law with Chinese characteristics, which nobody really knows what that means, except to me what that means is that there's strong centralized authority and limited fundamental rights, right? But that's, I do think that the dialogue leads to sort of a dialectic outcome, which suggests that there will be something new that comes out of the dialogue, and that the something new, I think, will be less Western. And in particular, using fundamental rights as an example, the right balance for freedom of speech, I think, is certainly open to debate. And I think that the Chinese position on that will be, not the Western position. It will be more collectively oriented. How that actually plays out, it's hard to say. The most interesting area, I think, will be around this idea of democracy, whatever that is. Or let's talk about it in terms of accountability, right? So if there is some version of accountability for the Communist Party, what does that look like? And is that sufficient that we don't have to do something that's more democratic? When I was talking about this topic with somebody recently, they said, well, you can't really defend democracy because you've got Trump in as president and he's crazy. And I don't disagree with that. But I was in France the day that Trump was elected, and I was lecturing French students, and they're like, what happened? And I said, it's democracy. People choose, and they choose who they want. And I don't want that person, but I was outvoted. And, that kind of thing happens. And it has problems, right? The people can make a bad choice. So I think that there will be something that evolves out of this notion of legitimacy and accountability. And I'm not really sure what it's going to be. I had this interesting conversation with my friend who's a political scientist who's been working in China. And we were talking about the party leadership and how, they just want to identify the best people, and they'll have sort of, I think about it as sort of, the beneficent dictator, sort of the Platonic idea of philosopher king, and everything will be all right. And I'm like, I believe in the market, and I don't think the market forces are going to give you the best people in the way that you select them from the Communist Party. I mean, my experience has been there are a lot of really talented people in China who are not Communist Party members and don't want to be Communist Party members, who are involved in, business and law and other things. And if you're going to try to have a ruling elite and you can't get the best people, that's a problem, right? I mean, democracy makes mistakes too, but democracy on the whole, I think, tends to, people tend to choose good leaders. And if they're bad leaders, you vote them out, right? Now, there are corruption issues and other things that make it imperfect, but I think that the area around government accountability is what will be really interesting. There may be a completely new model, right? A socialism or, communism that's more market oriented. I mean, these things are almost oxymorons, but there will be something new. And I think it's a role model for then, other countries.
Okay. We'll start from there. But why not I collect all the questions and then
Okay.
you have one go, please. Yeah.
Yes, I've had several meetings with the party school in Beijing since Xi Jinping was in fact head of the party school before he became president. But I have to say I'm extremely impressed with the people who are working in the party school. Well, they have philosophers and historians and economists on almost every issue imaginable. And what they said to me was that when Xi Jinping took over, first of all, he would tackle corruption. Secondly, he would look at quality of life regarding the environment in China. And then thirdly, and I guess this is coming with the decade ahead of us, that they would look at political reform. And certainly up to now, they seem pretty much on track from what they said 5 years ago.
I just wonder, I don't know whether this is valid, but I just bring it out about data. Are you comparing like with like in a way? Because when you talk about all these other countries, you have a system where kind of that's not the system in China. The party is top, so the army, the police, the courts, everybody doesn't feel they have to report to the country. They don't. It's not the country that is the top and that they're patriotic to, in a way. It's the party. I don't think I put that very well, but the party is different in China to other countries.
It's just a brief observation which reflects Susan's earlier question on data collection. I don't know whether it's significant or not, but I find it a bit disturbing that on the web page for the Rule of Law Index, where they provide actually wonderfully constructed and very effective questionnaires, you have versions in several languages but not Chinese. The problem is if you look at the way in which a number of international human rights instruments are translated into Chinese and almost acquire a semi-official status, you see lots of key sensitive concepts not properly written in Chinese. And I would worry about the faithfulness of Chinese versions of these questionnaires given the very difficult circumstances of doing this kind of research in China.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit curious about how the cultural analysis is conducted. Because I ask because I'm not exactly convinced that the dichotomy individuality and then versus collective values would be very useful in Chinese context. I mean, I'm not like expert in Chinese studies, but as sort of a Chinese growing up in Hong Kong, as far as I know, I think the basis of like how Chinese culture is based, and it's more like on the basis of family rather than like individual versus a huge country or huge nation. So I was wondering if that is being considered or factored when you say measuring the cultural dimension on that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Questions?
So I certainly agree that that they're on track in terms of working on corruption, and that's part of the reason that I am optimistic. That I think that there is a possibility, and the corruption, as I say, that for me, that the key point of the presentation is this paradox about corruption. That the best explanation, I think, is that it has to do with legitimacy. I do think that there is a data problem in trying to compare like to like, and I certainly agree that it must be very difficult to try to collect data about human rights issues, because I suspect that the surveys are going to have to be approved by some government official, and if they're approved by a government official, then you worry about the way that the words are, the way that it's framed. That data problem is probably going to push China away from rule of law, not towards rule of law. It's not likely, I don't think it's likely to be an error that will make them look better than they are. It's likely to make them look worse than they are. But it's, I don't have enough detail to know, and I think it's a very valid point. With respect to the governments, it's also a valid point, though there are 113 countries, and that same problem exists for other countries. So it goes to the validity of the concept of, what do you mean by government, and how does that play out? With respect to the cultural analysis, I don't know I'm using the analysis that they have conducted. It's based on survey work. It's been replicated, but I don't know really beyond that the particulars of how that has been constructed. But it has been replicated. If you do a literature review, you'll find some really unusual and interesting studies where, for example, first-generation Chinese immigrants, when given the survey instruments, show up as being Chinese, even though they speak sort of native English in the U.S. Or they do it with Koreans. There's some really interesting social psychology work, but I'm not a social psychologist, so I can't really answer your question very aptly, other than to say it's pretty well accepted. It's been replicated a number of times. They're based on survey data. And that this is sort of a cross-cultural notion. It's not just trying to identify Chinese culture, but there are studies that look specifically at Chinese culture on these scales to try to measure it, and there is replication. So,
Thank you so much for the food for thought, and we need to give you some food for the stomach.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
I do a lot of
Thank you very much.
Thank you.